So the next thing I'm going to cover in more depth is going to be some of the restoration tools that we're going to be covering or discussing. Because the next assignment will be taking an image with flaws and removing flaws from the photograph using a variety of tools. So in this particular image, great looking gal. She's looks like she could probably use a little more sleep, maybe some eye cream, and we're gonna remove some of the bags and the crow's feet from around her eyes. Now, I covered in a previous session how we can use snapshots to take progress images. But another way that's really great for doing this is by making a duplicate of your layer. So the original layer will always remain present, but you will update a copy of that layer. So in order to do this, you can go up to Layer and click Duplicate Layer. It will name it a copy. Say OK. You can see that there's a copy. Another way that you can go about doing it, and the way I'll typically do it, is using Command right-click or right-clicking on that layer and picking duplicate layer there. So you can see that as I turn them off, you won't, it's going to look like they're identical until I start making updates. So the healing brush is great here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit extra to deal with some of these regions. And I'm going to, again, use a brush that's nice and small, nice and little. And I'm going to use that brush to softly erase some of those problem regions. Now you can see it doesn't always give me an ideal result. Sometimes I'll have to touch up an area more than one time. Sometimes I might have to go back in and clean up areas that didn't come out exactly how I'd like. I might need to adjust my brush. Let's see, spacing down, hardness down to make sure that it's a nice soft brush. And I'm literally just tracing the lines that I want to remove. If it's not giving me a result that I would like, switch to the healing brush, which has a little bit more control, and source an area and use that clean area to tidy up the regions that aren't quite playing nice. If it doesn't look right, like you can see I've got a shadow there, Command Z or Control Z to undo. And I jump between the two tools quite a bit. If it's not giving me what I'd like, if I just can't get one tool to maybe give the results that I could, something that I could use, that's what the undo key is for, and you have multiple tool options for a reason. So all you got to do is clean it up, make it look nice. In the event that some areas, it's picking up parts of her eyebrow or parts of her eyelid potentially, so I'm just softening it up. Just trying to give her a little bit more of a little more youthful, a little less tired. So you can see I've made quite a few clicks. My history is shot, but I can disable my top layer. I'll usually name this my working layer, because that's the layer I'm doing all the work on. Now let's compare before and after. Pretty substantial, huh? It's like airbrushed looking. Let's do the rest of her face. If you ever open up a magazine, or you're even in the grocery store, in Publix, and you've got all the magazine racks right there at the checkout, take a look at some of those people's faces and realize Every single one of them, no matter how nice their skin is or how great their hair looks or how perfect their makeup appears, even the gentlemen, those muscles you think look chiseled, chances are they've had some retouching done. You can even go on YouTube and find a lot of videos of celebrities, how they looked before the photo was touched up and then how they looked after the photo was touched up. It's a pretty shocking difference, and it's definitely, you know, worth looking at other people's work. Just trying to lighten this area up. It's just pulling in too much dark from the hair. I might grab my clone stamp tool, turn the hardness all the way down, and I might just do a little bit of clone stamp in there just to, too bright. Let's see. I'll lower the opacity a little bit. Get it to blend a little bit better. And then I'll switch back to spot healing and just blend it in a little bit more, just so it doesn't look like she's got a bruise or something. So you can see it's kind of a pain in the butt there. Maybe I'll switch over to the patch tool and grab another section of her face and move it. Oops. Move it where I'd like it to look. Ooh, that is not what I want. Let's try it this way. There we go. Much nicer. Shall I just soften up just a little bit? It's looking like she's got a corner to her cheek, which isn't really what's happening. Let's give that another try. No cheek corners. And do just a little bit of work up here because you can see there's some fine wrinkles happening up here. Now what I'm doing here is I'm clicking in one area, coming up to another area and holding down the shift key, and it draws a straight line of that tool across the region that I'm clicking in. So it's like taking a ruler between those 2 points and just using a straight line of information to soften. And you can do that with any tool that's based on the way that the paintbrush works. So you can do it with the brush, you can do it with any of the healing tools, you can do it with sharpen and smudge and blur, you can do it with burn and dodge. Okay, so again, before and after. They're pretty remarkable tools. There's a shadow here underneath her eye I'm still not too keen on, so I might come back in and spend a little bit more time touching that up, just so it doesn't look like she's got, you know, mascara smeared on her face or something. Ugh. There we go. But there's no one way to do it. You could use any combination of the tools. Everybody's going to work a little bit different. So it's important to know and be comfortable with the fact that you might have to jump between several sets of tools in order to get the end result that you'd like. You know, and I could work all day on this. I could, you know, get rid of some of these discolorations, these spots up here. I could play all day with her face, but we're gonna do a few different ones. Here's another example. Not a bad looking guy. If we wanted to soften and remove some of these, the patch tool works really well for long regions like this. but I don't want to duplicate it. So it's important to recognize what your settings are if it's not doing what you'd expect it to. Now it just looks like he's got a subtle dimple. If the tool's not doing what you'd expect it to do, it's definitely worth checking the settings or switching to a different tool entirely. Close bracket to open, just to smooth out. Always remember though, if you're using a tool that requires you to sort of paint in, whether it's spot healing or healing brush, don't use a brush bigger than you need. And by that I mean, again, don't use a brush. If you've got a teeny little wrinkle, don't use a huge brush because it's going to put things in places you don't want it. That's totally defeats the purpose. That's not what we're wanting here. There we go. Nice and easy. Oops. And I forgot to duplicate, so I guess I'll jump back here. So before, after, before. He doesn't look old to begin with, but he looks significantly younger once the wrinkles are removed. Always duplicate your layers. Always, always, always. Now, we're just doing some light cosmetic work here, but if you have someone that has like some pretty devastating skin issues, these tools are perfect for that. We're going to give her kind of a skin makeover here using these tools, and spot healing is great for things that you don't want, like pimples. Now, you can see there's quite a bit of work to do here. This isn't, you know, a wrinkle. So my biggest suggestion is to always take care of some of the little stuff first, because if you take care of all the big things first, sometimes it'll pick up other problem areas around it. So what I like to do is I actually work on little things so that if I need to sample from an area, hopefully it's clean enough that I can bring some of these areas over once they've been cleaned up. Hair is probably one of the trickier things, so just pay attention as you work. Try not to accidentally put hair in a place it doesn't belong. That's never a good thing. And I've done all of this so far with the spot healing brush tool, so I haven't needed to source anything. Just trying to clear up. It's like a magic eraser. Don't you wish one of these tools existed in real life? I know I do. And since some of these pores are pretty big, I'm just trying to get rid of some of these extra spots. Okay, so we've removed the major issues, but now we need to clean up some of the texture. I'm going to make an additional layer. So I'm going to call this layer pimples, because that's what we removed. And then, oops, didn't need to create a new layer. Right click, duplicate. And then I'll call this one texture, because we're going to be softening the skin texture. So now I'm going to switch my blending mode of this tool to screen, and I'm going to make it bigger. And screen is going to just slightly soften and even out what the skin is doing. Now I don't want to use it too much, because you can see a little too much of the use, it's starting to sort of blur. So that's not quite coming out the way I'd like it to. Let's see, switch back to normal. Just work with the spot healing tool some more. I'm working a little bit with a bigger, larger brush, just because I'm working with a more generalized area. I just want to smooth out some of the texture a little bit. See, getting extra hair in places I don't want. This is bad. Undo key. That's why we don't want to work too large if we don't have to. Reducing the shine a little bit. Still light, but it's not as oily looking. There's another option that we can also use. I'm going to grab a lasso tool and give it a try. I'm just going to highlight sort of a discolored area. And I'm going to go to Edit, Fill, and I'm going to select an option called Content Aware. And this particular tool is useful when you want to try and fill it with stuff that's around it. So I'm just going to hit OK and see what happens. Okay, so that solved some of the issue. It gave me this thing, I'm not sure where this came from, that I could edit out, but it did take care of some of the texture a little bit. Oop, don't want to erase her mouth, that's no good. So she's still pretty rosy, but it's a little bit more consistent and way more soft than this. And again, I could continue to work on this for quite a while. I actually enjoy this type of restorative work. It's kind of methodical in a sense. So it takes a good eye. You need to pay close attention to the types of editing that you're performing. Then I could continue to, adjust hair and whatnot if I'd like to. But I'm going to move to the next way that we can do some restorative stuff. Now in this case, not only does she have some wrinkles, but I think that I would like to brighten up her teeth a little bit. So I'm gonna do what I did before. I'm gonna not layer from background, duplicate layer, call on my working layer. Grab my spot healing tool and just dive right in, start softening some of these lines up. Ooh, looks like her little smile lines got copied over, so let's, there we go. Maybe soften that shadow a little bit. Actually, I'll leave the shadow in because when I remove it, it looks like she's got a really big face. Just softening some of the smile lines, maybe giving her just one instead of two. You can see there's some weird stuff going on if you're not careful. I'll leave her face alone, we'll deal with the eyes in this case. Now, you can see as I work, I tend to zoom in and zoom out a fair amount. Part of the reason that I don't just stay zoomed in is because sometimes sometimes the edits that you've performed look fine until you zoom out and realize that maybe there's a shadow in the wrong spot. So if I zoom in so I can see details, I like to zoom out to assess my work before I move forward, to make sure I didn't accidentally do something that maybe I'm not really enjoying as much as I could tell from up close. So I always zoom out and then zoom back into work. All right, so we've made some cosmetic adjustments. All right, so now I'd like to adjust her teeth. And I'm gonna do this using a mask. And the best way that I can compare a mask to like a real world thing is like a stencil. If you've ever used a stencil to maybe spray paint a yard sale sign, you put the stencil on the sign, the stencil has holes cut out of it, and you would paint through the holes, and the stencil masks or protects the areas that you don't want paint on. All right, so a mask uses a selection in very much a similar way. So when you combine a mask, I'm just going to make a general shape here. And these up here, these are adjustment layers. And these adjustment layers change what's inside of that selection and add a mask to your layer. So as an example, I'll click brightness. It looks like a sun. And you'll notice that as I change the brightness, it looks like there's sort of a spotlight on her face, okay? Based on the selection that I created. And if you look in my layers, it's made an adjustment layer. And inside of that adjustment layer is a black and white shape. And this is a mask. This is a layer mask, okay? So a layer mask is just a selection that's been used to alter a portion of the photo rather than the whole photo. If I had done the same thing without the layer mask, and I'm right-clicking to disable it, it would have made this change, which is also okay, but it's blowing out the photo. It's just too bright. It looks like, you know, she's going to get a sunburn or something. So the mask protects certain areas and only lets certain effects show through. Now, some of these options, such as density, will show how much or how little that mask is actually affecting the end product. Feather pertains to the outer edge. So if feather is set to 0, it's going to be a very sharp edge. If it's a little, if it's got a number to it, it's going to be a very soft edge. So it's going to be a much softer spotlight versus a very sharp spotlight. And you can adjust the mask a little bit more by refining the mask's edge also. So I'm going to delete that. I just clicked on it and hit my delete key. And I'm going to use a selection tool to make a selection of her teeth. So I'm going to pick the magnetic lasso tool because that's going to give me the closest amount of, it doesn't need to be perfectly exact, but I'd like it to be at least a little bit precise. There we go. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to pick the same option, well, brightness contrast, and I'm going to bring up the brightness. Now you can see clearly nobody has teeth out right. It starting to look like she has a new set of dentures or something. That's just silly. That doesn't at all look natural. It's too sharp and too vibrant. Plus, you can start to see there's still a little bit of yellow there. You're just making it neon at this point. So I'm going to reduce that. Now, I'd like to adjust my selection a little bit. So I'm going to right-click on my mask, and I'm going to add the mask to a selection. The nice thing about masks is when you've got this black and white icon, it will display the selection that you've made if you reselect it. So unlike just using the selection tool outright, when perhaps you, if you click in the wrong spot or deselect, you can't get back to it if it's not in your history, masks let you do that. So I would like to refine my mask. So I am going to select Refine Edge. What this does is it limits me to look at just the area inside of that selection. Radius lets you fade out or fade in a little bit. I'm going to leave that low where it was. Smooth, you can see it gets rid of the corners. So smooth is nice to just sort of generally adjust your mask. Feather we covered already. It fades in, or fades out or fades in. Contrast kind of does the opposite of feather. Shift edge, if I take it in the negatives, it brings the edge in. If I bring it in the positives, it brings the edge out. So I'm just going to smooth that out, and I've already feathered, let's see, let's try one, feathered a little bit. All right, so I'm just softening the selection. I'm making it less like every tooth is glowing in the dark and more like, the light is just hitting it through her lips, okay? And I'm gonna output this to my selection. So you can see my selection has changed quite a bit. So here's what I had before, and here's what I have after, okay? Now I'm going to adjust the brightness a little bit. You can see it's a little more natural looking. I'm going to delete the old one. Another thing that I can do, I'm going to right click, add the mask to selection, is I'm going to come to this option. It's called the hue and saturation, and it looks like, kind of looks like a gradient in a way. I'm going to click on it, and I'm going to desaturate just a little bit. Now, if I desaturate too much, she has gray teeth, and that's gross. But by taking it from 0 and going into the negative just a little bit, it takes away the yellow just enough so that they start to look a little closer to white. We're not doing gray, but we just want to soften the yellow a touch. So whereas before her teeth looked kind of dingy, we brightened them up and we just lightened them, got them out of the yellow zone a little bit. And now it's starting to look a little more realistic versus what was there before. And masks are great. If we wanted to take it a step further and maybe brighten up the color of her eyes, we could do that too. I'm gonna grab the same tool, magnetic lasso. I'm gonna try my best to give her a nice, good selection here. There we go. I'm gonna hold down my shift key to add both eyes to the mask at the selection at the same time. All right. While I have the select tool or a selection tool visible, you'll notice that the refinage button is displayed. So I'm going to click that, smooth it out. Don't need to feather much, just smoothing does the trick. I'll hit OK. Now I'm going to grab hue and saturation, and I'm going to play with the scroll bar, and you're going to see that I can really play with the color of her eyes. You want green eyes? Cool. You want turquoise blue eyes? Cool. If she wanted purple eyes, we could do that. So it's kind of like getting able to play with contacts without actually needing them to be in your eye as you work. And maybe I'll lower the opacity just a little bit to make them a little more convincing and rather than looking like she might have contacts in. Pretty cool. So again, here's where we started. Made some light cosmetic changes, brightened up some teeth. Both of those steps were brightening up teeth, and then adjusted the color of her eyes. Pretty nice. Now, one of the reasons I'm introducing you to masks, there are other ways that you can go about doing this particular function, but masks are great because they're non-destructive. The change is made on its own layer. It isn't permanent, so you could always delete the layer. You could even, if you change your mind and decide, you know what, I don't want green eyes, I want eyes that are closer to blue, you can double click on it and open up some of those options right off the bat and then close it back down. A lot of the other options, and especially if you're self-taught, one of the ways a lot of students like to go about doing this is going to image and then clicking image adjustments and then picking hue and saturation here. But the problem with that is if I make a hue and saturation change here, I'm doing it to the whole layer, not just to a certain area. Even if I make a selection, it's still being applied to the layer itself. And this would be considered destructive editing. So masking is something that everyone's going to get in the habit of doing because it's going to give you the most flexibility in regards to editing imagery. This way, provided that, you know, if you're working with a client that needs, you know, eye color changed or hair color changed or lipstick color changed, or you designed a logo and they've decided to rebrand and change the colors entirely, if you do it using adjustment layers, it's going to be a very easy fix. Whereas if you do it in a destructive editing method, it's going to take you a lot longer to make those corrections. So those are some of the perks of using masks, and I'll be going over many different ways to use masks throughout the term. Lastly, do some cosmetic work to something that isn't a person's face. If we wanted to touch up this particular photograph, let's say I want to maybe get rid of the cable line, maybe hide the alley or whatever this is that's over to one side. but also maybe fill up this trellis a little bit more with leaves rather than having it look kind of bare. These same tools are going to be able to perform those functions also. So I'm going to go to some of my tried and true tools, clone stamp. Just try to remove that pipe. Makes short work of it. We remove some of these dots, whatever those are. I don't know if it's a bug or something. Another way that you can correct problem areas is you can actually take a section of a layer and Command or Control C and Command and Control V. That will actually paste that section on its own layer. So if I wasn't quite sure how to handle that, I can always copy it, paste it over, maybe make a duplicate, move that one down a little bit. I'm going to clean up where it's cutting off leaves, so we'll adjust that. Now I'm going to go in, and you can see how there's like a seam here. I want to clean that up. So I'm going to use my shift click. Trick here, you see how it's not really doing a lot of work? Make sure if you've got multiple layers, check the sample all layers box, because that will make sure rather than just working on the active layer, the layer that's highlighted, it will see all the other layers beneath it. There we go. Now the seam's a little less visible. Just try to break this up a little bit since the stucco doesn't line up anymore. Okay, so now down here, now if I use some of these tools, it's going to remove the poles, but it's not really going to help with the leaves at all. You know, it just looks like I'm erasing stuff. So this is where the clone stamp is actually a really useful tool, because the clone stamp will let you, I'll adjust my tool here, I'll up the opacity. It'll let you Option or Alt click and copy. Oops, helps if I'm on the correct layer. Alt click or Option click and physically copy those leaves. If I wanted to take it a step further, you can see this one especially is starting to just look a little bit too soft. If I wanted it to feel like leaves and have texture on the edges like leaves, one of the things that you can do with the clone stamp tool that you can't do with some of the other healing tools is select different tool sets. So if I pick this leaf tool, I'm going to open it up here and maybe adjust the dynamics of the tool a little bit. You see that texture? That texture is much closer to what the leaves are actually doing than that soft, round-edged brush. So let's see, let me make my brush larger. I'm gonna Option click. Whoa, that is a big brush. How did it get so big? Let's try that again. Option click. Much closer to what I'm looking for in terms of texture. So if I wanted to cover up the trellis and make this vine or plant or whatever it is just look a little bit more full, and I'm sourcing and repainting in a lot of different spots, so I'm not just clicking and dragging because I'm going to end up, you know, creating doubles of certain things. That's not what I'm looking for, but I'm clicking and cloning and clicking and cloning some more and clicking and cloning some more. All right. Much clearer cleaner and more full and lush looking than what it was before. Yes? Next up, we're going to discuss some other ways you can use some of the restorative tools.